I'd like to call this special meeting of the Board of Education to order. The next regular Board of Education meeting will be held on Tuesday, January 22nd at 7:30 p.m. in the Board of Education meeting room. I'll open tonight where we may have probably, and I may in the future, open for budget seasons or recommend an opening. And that is kind of a brief, quick overview of what we're actually doing up here. And I say that because we are working with so many committees and other town volunteers that I think sometimes it's just great to remind you what the board is. We've heard a lot of feedback one way or the other on things people would like changed or not changed. So what the board does by state statute is provide an itemized estimate of the cost of the maintenance of schools for the ensuing year. What the state actually requires for that are broad budgetary categories, including salaries, fringe benefits, utilities, supplies, and ground maintenance. Now, as you all have those big, heavy budget books, what you know is we do much more than that. We do our best here in Darien to provide you with a budget that is clear, that is accurate. We welcome your questions, and we welcome the questions from committees. We appreciate them. It pushes us, it pushes the thinking and the overall benefit to the taxpayer and to our school children. However, some of the comments of late about cushioning in the budget, which really is a nicer word than saying padding, is not really what's going on. The state statute also goes on to say that money appropriated by any municipality for the maintenance of public schools shall be expended by and in the discretion of the Board of Education. The board may transfer any unexpended or uncontracted for portion of any appropriation for school purposes to any other itemized estimate. And that's what you see when we approve budget transfers. So at times when you look at a budget year to year and you say, oh, why did things move? Oh, why is that there? It's because what we're dealing with is children, not widgets. And so you will see that children emerge, they're dynamic, they have needs that we try to anticipate but are not always anticipated. So year over year comparisons are not always the best way to understand a budget. With that said, we do our best to anticipate now what we will need for little learners 18 months away. So I just say that so you understand what our statutory responsibility is and how far we go to try to break that down and make it so people can follow and understand into really small individual line items. But if you do see transfers year over year, you can follow those. You can understand why. But that is what we do, and it is such an important part of what we do that the state statute enumerates it, because it is not only what Darien does, it is what boards of education do, because it's the business we are in. We appreciate all the questions we get. We have 2 RTM committees here to make comments tonight, and we welcome and receive them. But I do want that clarification, because our budget is a little different than the town budget. How we expend money is different. And we welcome questions on that, but I do think it's an important issue to note. With that, I will turn it over to public comment.
I timed this, so we should be okay.
Okay. We just need your name and address, please.
Mm-hmm. My name is Cammie O'Brien, and I live at 54 Andrews Drive. I'm here today to explain why I support the proposal to add another psychologist to each of the Darien elementary schools. I'm a parent of a first grader and soon-to-be kindergartner at Tokenique, and I am also an educator at Pelham Memorial High School in Pelham, New York. Speaking from both perspectives, I feel it is imperative that we allow our students, our children, to have more access to mental health professionals within our schools. My children are just starting out on their educational journeys, so I don't know what their needs will be in the next few years. That said, I can tell you what I've seen from an educator's perspective teaching in today's world and in a district that is quite similar to the Darien School District. I think we can all agree that these are uncertain, frightening times, filled with unknowns. As an adult, the news each day is hard to process. Now imagine being a child trying to process all of it. It's no surprise that a lot of the younger generation are struggling. And even if we take our current political climate out of it, imagine being a child or young adult living in the age of social media. When we were growing up, you had a hard day at school, it stayed there. In today's society, it doesn't. You have a hard day and you can't escape it. If you're being bullied at school, it continues in the virtual world when you get home. Everyone has something to say, only escalating the stress and compounding the negativity. And online, as we know, people's keyboard confidence allows for some unbelievable vitriol. In my district, our mental health professionals are overworked and understaffed, even with the additional social workers the board approved for this school year. So many of these kids are struggling for a variety of reasons: gender issues, abusive households, broken homes, bullying, drugs and alcohol, the pressures of applying to college in a highly competitive environment, and the list goes on and on. As a high school teacher, I've seen the toll this has taken on our student population. Last school year, we had about 12 students, maybe more, who were institutionalized at some point during the school year for suicide attempts or rehab or depression or all of the above. Regardless of the reason, that is just unacceptable. We need to do better for these kids. And yes, that number is outrageous, and you may be saying to yourself, that's got to be some kind of anomaly. And unfortunately, it's not. Mental health issues among our youth are on the rise, and we need to meet that demand. As far as I can tell, early intervention is the only answer. If we can reach these students earlier, we may be able to avoid some of the issues plaguing them during their high school careers, or at least provide them with better coping mechanisms when problems do arise. For these reasons, I respectfully ask you to seriously consider this proposal. While you may see the money to pay for these additional FTEs as excessive or unnecessary, I'm here to tell you, as a Darien taxpayer, it is not. In the end, the mental health of our children is everything. If we have the means, why wouldn't we provide them with as many tools as we can in order to successfully navigate our increasingly uncertain world?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sorry?
Want her prepared comments? I'll just pass them on.
No, that's fine.
Catherine Perkowski, 152 Old Kings Highway North. I'm also here to speak in favor of the addition of psychologists at the elementary school level. And I've been following the conversation pretty closely. And I just wanted to bring a perspective to the board that you may not have heard before. I am a parent of a child with special needs. I also worked, although I'm not speaking for them, I worked as a co-chair of the CDSP Special Education Committee. So I know a lot about what a lot of people, a lot of parents in the district who have kids with special needs, and a lot about the development of the programs and what a good program should look like, what it's like to sit in an IEP or in a PPT, what it's like to have to review an IEP and review all the documents and evaluations that go along with that. So as I'm listening to you all speak, it seems like we're really talking about we need psychologists in sort of three separate buckets. So we need one for a bucket for kids with special needs, right? In order to have a psychologist there on the team to evaluate. Then we have another bucket for kids in crisis, right? And then we have another bucket to develop a social and emotional learning program. So the social and emotional learning bucket is empty, right? So we're hoping to fill that. The way that it's been presented in general is that, and I'm going to make the math really easy, 80% of the school I'm making this up. This is not accurate, but 80% of the school psychologist's time is spent in PPTs or preparing for PPTs or doing evaluations, and 20% of that time is spent helping kids who are in some kind of a crisis situation. What I can tell you from reality is when you look at that, even if you know that this is the number of meetings scheduled, you're underestimating the dedication of our staff to address what the needs are of all the kids in all the schools. What ends up happening in reality is you might have a psychologist at your meeting, but they may not be there for the whole meeting. They may abruptly have to leave and help another child, which is as it should be. Or an administrator who's at your meeting may have to leave because the school psychologist is involved in your meeting and someone has to be there for that child. So my reason for talking about this is, in my view, even without the social emotional piece, we're already understaffed. And I think it's valuable to deal with the social emotional piece in order to prevent the kids in crisis piece. So I just wanted to give you sort of that perspective from a parent. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any additional public comment this evening? We'll move on to the superintendent's report. Dr. Landon. Oh, the superintendent report's not on here. I'm sorry. Tonight we receive our comments from RTM Education and the RTM Finance and Budget Committee. I would invite RTM Education to the podium, please. Mrs. Satori?
Hi. I guess I could just introduce our group, most of whom are here, and say that tonight we're going to provide you with some of the public scrutiny that makes Darien schools the fine educational institutions that they are. It's in that vein that we ask our questions about personnel, enrollment, operations, facilities, athletics, and other things. Our committee is comprised of a cross-section of Darien citizens who represent all 6 districts of the RTM. We want to see that taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and that students are treated well in a district where the overarching philosophy is that schools exist for students, for children. I could go over the questions specifically. I sent them to you, so I don't know that reading them now would be a good idea. What would you like?
We've received them as a board, but the floor is yours, so it's really up to you how you would like to proceed.
Okay, well, why don't I go over the areas that we questioned, okay, just so that you know that. Okay, there was a concern that the budget book isn't particularly user-friendly, and I know we have several new people on the committee, and perhaps they are struggling with the fact that it is not for them as transparent as they would like it to be. There were some concerns about how other DRGs present their budgets, whether perhaps they use OpenGov, that sort of thing. And all in the sense that if the people in the town understand the budget, they may be more supportive of some of the costs as some of the funds that you've asked for to support some of your initiatives. So we'd also like to see a little more consistency when people in HRC describe their budget and their budget initiatives. Some people give 2 sentences, some people give 2 pages. I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason for that, but that's something we'd be interested in. In terms of enrollment, this was something we struggled with a little bit. There is some interest in knowing more about the outplacements, and in that vein, we had also thought that perhaps Darien should keep track of all the students in the district who are K to 12, and whether they go to a private school or a public school. Then at least you would know how many students are possibly out there should a school close or should the economy change as it did a few years ago and people want to come back to the public schools. You have some idea of what the total number is out there. We were interested specifically in questions in the personnel area. I know people have talked a lot about the psychologists. We would like to have more information about that, whether a counselor or a social worker would be equally helpful, whether there could be a team approach with that so that you have a variety of skills there. We also, with all respect, wondered what if a new superintendent comes in and has a different plan? Will you have these people online, and not quite know what to do with them? I think overall, we'd like to see the board own this as opposed to the superintendent owning it. Because if the board owns it, then another person comes in, you can make sure your wishes are known to him or her, and the whole thing will continue that way. Whereas if it's one administrator's idea and the administrator goes away, things can change, and that can be kind of a problem with extra personnel. We also talked about whether a psychologist might meet with the board to describe how their day, or a psychologist and a teacher, to describe how their day would look with this special support, how it looks now, how it might look at another time. Are there people sort of waiting to see a psychologist who don't get a chance, like you had 9 people referred and only 6 of them got to see the psychologist, that kind of thing. There's some concern about athletics, that the deep dive that happened last year wasn't quite what we were looking for. Interested in what the relationship is with the booster clubs, the DAF, and the parents. The number of coaches, the dollars spent, the cut policy. What's the procedure when a piece of equipment fails? We had someone complain that their child's goalie equipment was being taped to them. That doesn't sound like a good idea. So perhaps you could give the town a little bit of an idea of how the athletic director would find that out, whether he would make a requisition for new goalie equipment. How would that work? And overall, is it the board's goal to have equity in what parents pay for athletics? There's a lot of talk about that, so perhaps we'd like to know what's your goal. Is it something where you say, well, different sports cost different amounts of money, and you have to put up with it? If you want to play ice hockey, it costs a lot. Or whether you think that everybody should sort of have play on an even field. We were concerned a lot about security, but understand that we can't have a public discussion about it. So we'd like some reassurance about what you're doing in the security area. We were also very impressed by, RC 20, the technology RC described very well what, how they were going to spend the money. We thought that was a good model. We were interested in whether you want to do OpenGov. That was something that we were think might be helpful with making the budget more transparent. And finally, I would be interested in just knowing in general what you thought of our questions. What can we do for you in a way that perhaps some of the questions are easy to answer, some are difficult. We're not trying to just ask questions for the sake of asking questions. What would be the biggest impact that we could make for you? So anyway, that's kind of where we are right now. I appreciate your time and hope you'll get back to us. Thank you.
So as is our tradition, we will, I have forwarded those questions on to the administration. They will answer, and at our meeting, we will go over and provide answers. I do think, if the board will indulge me a moment and feel free to opine in on this, we've heard a lot of talk about OpenGov. We've had a lot of talk of should the board be on OpenGov. I will say it is not in one of our goals and initiatives, and it is a major kind of technological initiative. So if it is something the board wants to answer or take up, the appropriate time would be during goals and initiatives to have a conversation about that rather than midstream, as that's not one of the things either on our technology department's forefront or on the finance department's forefront. My feeling on the word transparency with OpenGov is that it might be a different word choice. There's a user friendliness that may come along with OpenGov, but I certainly think that the budget is transparent, and I don't know that OpenGov in and of itself provides transparency. So those may be things that board members should think about if that's something that they would like to bring up during goals and initiative time. Then I think that's probably the best spot to do that, and talk to the administration if that's a goal that we would like, and they would have time then to work on it. So given that RTM Education has mentioned it, the Board of Finance mentioned it, I think we kind of need to put it to rest for this current year. And if it's something we want to explore during goals and initiatives, any board member can feel free to bring that forward. And with that, we will, unless there are comments or questions for education, I think we'll follow the regular form of answering their questions and engaging them. Okay. We will invite the Finance and Budget Committee.
Good evening. My name is Taylor Carter, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Finance and Budget Committee of the RTM. Thank you all for inviting us to share our thoughts with you tonight. I want to start by thanking you, Dr. Landon, for your assistance this year. You really stepped up in our time of need, and we truly appreciate both your expert guidance and generosity in your contribution of your time. Mrs. Achman, members of the board, we also want to thank you for all the work you do on behalf of our schools. Your balanced concern for both the well-being of our students and the community at large are evident in your daily dialogue and decision-making, and we are grateful for the steady hand with which you guide the system. I will admit our committee struggled to organize its thoughts for this presentation. Sure, there are line items here and there that we'll ask you to dig deeper on, but largely, this budget is more concerning from a top-line perspective than a line item one. Before diving in, and without getting too granular, I will say that challenges and initiatives at the state level continue to concern members of our committee. Will Darien be targeted as a part of the state's budget solution going forward? I don't think we can discount the possibility. At the local level, we're getting ready to build a new school. We've recently launched Fitch Academy, expanded our high school cafeteria, invested in department heads, resurfaced our baseball field, and now we're discussing the addition of 4 new psychologists in our elementary schools. Simultaneously, our real estate market is soft, and we're hearing from consultants that our student population is set to decline over the next 10 years. So where does this leave us? I have to say it gives me pause looking at a 3% top-line increase. But then there's reality. Not much of the increase in this budget is discretionary. The largest increases, aside from the psychologists, are due to the rising cost of insurance and predetermined salary increases. So, are we going to push back on the psychologists out of sheer sticker shock or ask you to suck blood from a stone? No. We believe that Darien must continue to invest in excellence. Not only is it the right thing to do for our children, but we believe it will be the best defense for our local economy and property values. If we continue to do the right thing, to follow best practices and make the right investments, Darien will continue to be a destination for new families and businesses for years to come. That said, this committee believes there is room for an overall reduction in the budget, and further, that both the strategic and accounting infrastructure to support some of these requests could be improved. I'll start by expanding on our desire for a more developed strategic infrastructure. In order to support the funding for some of these initiatives and ongoing investments, and to feel like we're moving toward a goal, members of this committee feel there needs to be a clearer strategic vision and plan communicated by the board. Where are we going? What are we building? For example, a strategic vision and plan for social emotional wellness would be extremely helpful in understanding the need for and role of the new psychologists. A vision and plan for athletics would help explain and support staffing, facilities, and equipment requests. A vision and plan for special education would help us understand initiatives to reduce costs and outplacements in the long term. At MMS, a vision and plan would help us understand your approach to House and the request for guidance counselors to support it. Further, what is the plan for department chairs once they have successfully synchronized the curriculum? What are the investments being made in curriculum research and development, and how do they relate to a broader academic plan? And finally, we want to be sure your vision and plan for security is being executed in a proactive way. Members of this committee do not feel capital investments in security should be made with excess funds from the budget, but should be planned for and requested or potentially reserved for as a part of the budget process. We feel confident that there is a way to discuss, request, and approve funding so as not to put systems or students at risk. Our desire to establish a more rigorous analysis and accounting of our spending is best summed up by a quote Jack has recently grown fond of: "That which gets measured gets managed." While we do measure plenty of things in the Board of Ed budget, we feel a step deeper, a more analytical step, could be taken. What is the total cost of hiring a new employee when we include benefits? How quickly are we recovering our investments in energy efficiency? What % of a psychologist's time is spent with typically developing students? We think these types of analyses would help all of us make better, more informed decisions. So as not to take too much time on this, I will simply summarize by saying that there are several other items this committee would like or would be interested in tracking, a list of which we can provide you in writing. And finally, I should note that our committee did not reach consensus on the addition of psychologists at the elementary schools, but that we all feel additional data and a more robust description of roles and goals for the new position are needed to feel more comfortable supporting the request. In closing, rather than pushing back on any single line item or initiative, we would like to ask the board to look closely at historic figures in determining necessary budget growth this year. After reviewing the details of actual spending versus approved budgets for the last 2 years, it has become evident that ample funds should be available to reduce this top-line figure in a generic way. While we understand that some flexibility needs to be available to absorb unforeseen costs, we believe that amount could potentially be reduced. We cannot support unnecessary taxation of our residents. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak tonight, and please let me know if you would like any more information on anything we have discussed.
Thank you. Well, we look forward to meeting with both the RTM Finance and Budget Committee and the RTM Education Committee once this budget is ours. I will remind everyone that at the moment this budget is in the hands of the administration, and we have a few more weeks before we adopt, change, modify, or any of those in between. So we will continue on. We thank you for your comments. They certainly help us inform us as we move forward, and we appreciate the work that went into them. Thank you. And with that, we will move on to further discussion on the 2019-2020 proposed budget items and follow-up questions on the 2019-2020 proposed budget. Dr. Landon.
Thank you, Mrs. Ackerman. We left the board last time, and I know the board had some real questions about the psychologists, and we're prepared to discuss those positions tonight. It was interesting that one of our first speakers from the audience spoke about what is seen at the end of the at one school career, especially at the high school level, the kinds of behaviors, activities, dilemmas that kids face. Interestingly enough, we have some really, really serious problems at the elementary level. And oftentimes we've been reluctant to talk about them because we're fearful that if we identify certain kinds of activities, people will be able to identify certain kids, and that's the last thing we want to do. But in fact, the problems have become so pervasive that you'll find these problems in every one of our schools. So what we're going to talk about tonight won't identify any one individual child in any one school or any group of kids, because what we're going to present tonight applies across the board. So let me say first that this is not an initiative that comes from the interim superintendent. In fact, the principals have been asking for school psychologists as additions to their pupil services staff for the last 2 years. In fact, last year, the administration moved a central office psychologist into the elementary schools 1 day per week in order to try to deal with the crisis that the principals were experiencing. So this is not a new issue. So why do we need psychologists? Let me give you an example of some of the behaviors that we see virtually every day in at least one of these, if not all of them on any one day. First is a question of anxiety. Many of our elementary schools are suffering from anxiety, both about their performance levels and their social skills. With the current arrangement, and our staff is here to explain to you what the day is like in a psychologist's repertoire on any one day, these issues of anxiety need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed as they occur. Depression. Depression is another serious issue that our elementary kids, many of them, face. Much of the depression is due to real or perceived problems with academic performance, others with learning differences because some learn better than others, or feel that others are learning in a superior way, and much of it is also due to social pressure. There's school avoidance. Kids don't want to come to school, even when they get to school. We send staff out every day to bring kids into school who refuse to leave their parents' vehicles to come into school. Our staff is trained to do that. The staff does it well, but it's an increasing burden that impacts all of our staff. We have behaviors in the classroom that are disruptive. They disrupt instruction and student work to the point that the specific child or the whole class needs to be removed to another location in the building. In some instances, it means the child has to be dealt with individually and the rest of the class moves out, or the child has to be removed from the class to allow the other kids to learn. We have sensation-seeking behaviors where kids will destroy property or injure other children. We have self-injurious behaviors where kids threaten to do things that are harmful to themselves and in the process could also be harmful to others. And then the worst one of all, where I've experienced this year so many elementary calls to 211 where kids evidence suicidal tendencies, suicidal ideation, an increasing problem. The problem is that our psychologists, currently with one in a school, cannot deal with these issues in a proactive way. For some, it's even difficult for them to deal with in a reactive way because there are so many burdens placed upon them in their daily assignments. So our principals, all of whom are here today, all of our elementary principals, for 2 years they've been asking for extra psychological help. Last year we gave them a little bit. But now they're saying we need 2 full-time psychologists in each of our buildings. And we're going to start with Shira Schwartz, who's the supervisor of all of our elementary psychs, who are going to take you on an overview of a day in the current life of a psychologist. And then the principals will follow with specific issues that we think you need to hear about. And I have to say, we are unanimous as a group in a need for these extra mental health professionals. And I must say, in response to the question from the member of the RTM tonight, a new superintendent may come in, but the new superintendent's not going to have any new ideas about mental health. The new superintendent is going to support what the principals have been asking for and what the principals believe in. Because any new superintendent, I'm sure it's going to be a good superintendent, isn't going to function in a vacuum, going to rely very much on building principals and the pupil services staff. So with that, Shira, if you want to come before the board and address the issue with the other principals. I think you know all the principals, right?
Yes.
You have, on the left, we have Mary Michelson, we have Paula Blakely, Julie Drola, we have Luke, and we have Dean Ketchum. So, and we have Shira on the far left.
I think is this on?
No.
There's no button. How about now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. This is not a good place. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening on our request for additional elementary school psychologists. Tonight, I have the privilege of representing the perspectives and the experiences of our very talented and very dedicated elementary psychologists. As educators, we deeply believe that effective early childhood education must include explicit learning across domains of development: social and emotional, physical, language and communication, cognition, and academics, so that children develop the competencies needed for continued success at school, at home, and in the community at large. Our graduate studies in school psychology impress upon us the statutory, ethical, and professional standards to which we are held accountable. We take very seriously our responsibility to create safe, healthy, and supportive learning environments for all children, and this forms the key tenets of our practice. We are taught that an active school psychologist provides the foundation for innovative approaches to collaboration, assessment and evaluation, instruction, and intervention. And this is the work that we train for and the work that we want to do. The National Association of School Psychologists underscores the importance of providing services by school psychologists to children with and without identified disabilities and risk factors. The state of Connecticut requires the integration of social and emotional learning as a key component of the elementary school curriculum. School psychologists are uniquely qualified to support these efforts given our expertise in child development, mental health, learning, and behavior. We are trained to support our colleagues and families in understanding children through a developmental lens.
Our expertise is needed for the design and ongoing implementation of best practice strategies so that children can develop the skills needed for communication, literacy, mathematics, and critical thinking, for meaningful participation in the classroom in activities and routines, for gaining the social and emotional skills they need to foster positive peer and adult relationships, and so that they can be resilient and learn how to cope in the 21st century learning environment. Research and our own experience tells us that the best possible outcomes for children are achieved through proactive, responsive, comprehensive, and highly coordinated efforts. But if you were to ask us how closely aligned our current model is to best practices, we would tell you that despite our very best efforts, we aren't quite meeting our own expectations and goals as practitioners. The elementary school principals are here to share the different areas in which our support is needed. We'll begin with Mary Michelson, principal of Tokenique Elementary School.
Good evening. Our students need to be ready and available to learn each and every day. Issues facing our elementary students in Darien range from social anxiety, school phobia, mean-spirited behaviors, self-harming behaviors, running away, depression, anger, defiance, grief, and family issues. Currently, these issues are addressed by one psychologist, teachers, and administrators. Crisis situations are part of our everyday school day. When they occur, a planned day is placed on hold. With two psychologists, we will proactively work with our children as well as be able to be available to the children at the moment of the impact and when they need the help the most. Having two psychologists will also allow for follow-up, to allow for resources and strategies for the students, teachers, and families. Two psychologists will allow for more time to work with individual children, small groups, provide in-class lessons to work proactively on self-awareness, management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. The foundation to its success is built on the relationship the children have with the school psychologist. We have to remember that crises aren't isolated to just one student. I'd like to share 3 different examples. Child number 1. For the past week, this child has displayed avoidance, anxiety towards school, and is unable to come to school. She is having daily meltdowns before the bus arrives. The child is in a crisis as well as the parent who is requiring assistance and advice. Our school psychologist will be available to meet with the child, parent, and teacher to create and implement a transition plan. Our school psychologist will continue to support the child as needed and will continue to build a positive relationship with both her and her family. Child number 2. She has experienced family home disruption and is lashing out and displaying defiant behaviors inside the classroom. Not only does this child need immediate intervention and support, her classmates and her classroom teacher will also need that support and strategies to continue the work in the day in that classroom. While working with the child, the school psychologist will create a plan for the child to re-enter the classroom as well as a plan for working on her concerns at home. Our school psychologist will work with the family and follow up with resources to help at home. Finally, child number 3 is undergoing a personal crisis that may affect the larger school community. These larger school community crises may include a death of a parent, a family member, a staff member, divorce, illness of a student, illness of a parent, illness of some family member or staff member, social media bullying, or on a state and national level, suicide and school shootings. These affect our children in elementary school every single day. All of these outside events affect our students and our children are not prepared to understand or to cope with these issues. Depending upon the situation, our school psychologist will meet with the individual students, family, classmates, schoolmates, staff, and other parents in the building. It impacts us all. Our children need another trained school psychologist to offer them this necessary and required support. Even with their extraordinary efforts, one school psychologist cannot realize these goals. When students feel safe, connected, prepared, and self-confident, they are available to learn and to reach their unique and full potential. This time I'd like to introduce Paula Blakely, who's going to talk about teachers and staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. What I'd like to emphasize is how critical it is for us to have a second school psychologist to meet the needs of our teachers and our staff. Right now, our school psychologists do the best they can to meet the needs of our faculty. However, given their current responsibilities, they simply do not have the time to engage in the essential, proactive approaches that we know are most effective in supporting our staff and ultimately our students. These proactive approaches include providing professional development relating to the teaching of our health and SEL curriculum, real-time coaching in classrooms, and one-on-one consultation with teachers and staff about ways to support individual student needs that Mary covered earlier. Having a second school psychologist will enable us to provide our classroom teachers with much needed professional development relating to the design, delivery, and implementation of social skills lessons and other aspects of our health and wellness curriculum. Our teachers need training and support in helping our students to learn strategies for managing their emotions, learning how to develop empathy for others, demonstrating respect, bullying prevention, and peer pressure, among many, many other topics. Having professional learning sessions in advance of the delivery of these lessons will allow our teachers to more completely unpack the essential understandings of each topic, to see how they're connected to one another, and to better understand how to deliver this information in ways that are developmentally appropriate for the age of the students. Within our current staffing model, our psychologists are not able to provide this type of teacher training on a consistent basis. Another best practice that we will be able to implement with the addition of a second psychologist is that of coaching. Coaching allows teachers and staff to have in context, in the moment, advice and guidance about a variety of situations. Given a psychologist's unique clinical training, coaching can help staff to see their environment or approaches from a different vantage point. This type of coaching can take many different forms. Coaching can happen when children are not even in the room. For example, a psychologist can help a teacher to re-look at his or her classroom space to determine how to reduce visual stimuli to support better focus and engagement. Coaching can happen while a teacher is teaching a lesson. The psychologist can provide on-the-spot feedback to the teacher about his or her approaches, the content of the lesson, and or the delivery of the information in order to make the lesson more effective. Coaching can happen after an observation. The psychologist can provide insights into how specific interactions with a child can be altered to allow for greater engagement or buy-in from that child. And coaching can also happen outside of the classroom completely. For example, in the cafeteria or on the playground, where paraprofessionals desperately need guidance about ways to support children who are struggling with simple things like making friends, that's not really that simple in elementary school, or resolving conflicts. Coaching can also happen with our specials teachers who might need guidance about how to translate a behavior plan that's mostly used in the classroom into their unique settings, such as the music room or the gym. Yet, given the limitations of having only one psychologist, we are not currently able to engage in this proactive form of support on more than an incidental basis. Finally, the one area where our teachers have consistently come to us as principals and asked for support over and over again from our school psychologists is in the area of managing different types of behaviors. Having an additional psychologist would allow for appropriate levels of support to our teachers who have students with very intense and specific issues. For example, there could be more time for our psychologists to work with our teachers around collecting data and developing behavior plans for issues such as helping students maintain attention or focus, helping students to control impulsive behavior, helping students to initiate or complete tasks, or even something as simple as helping a child to use kind words. Our psychologists could help teachers to support children struggling with situational issues such as divorce or a significant health issue or a death in the family. Our teachers also need support for those children with school phobia or social anxiety, because that doesn't end once the psychologist gets them into the building. An additional way our psychologists need to help our teachers is to support children who are experiencing emotional turbulence. And Dr. Landon referred to this repeatedly. We have children with withdrawal issues, depression, children who are acting out and hurting others, children who unfortunately in elementary school are having suicidal thoughts and taking action. Additionally, our psychologists need to help teachers to support students with executive functioning concerns, such as getting organized, following directions, or completing assignments. At this time, our psychologists offer as much support as they possibly can in these areas. However, as important as they are, these supports are often delivered in a reactive instead of proactive manner. Our hope is that with a second school psychologist, we can offer our teachers and staff the types of best practice supports that will lead to greater social and emotional health for our students. Next, Julie Droller from Hinley will share how a second school psychologist can further support our curriculum.
Good evening, everyone. Paula touched a little about how the psychologists could support instruction, but even before that, in developing our health and wellness curriculum, which social emotional learning is a part of, it would be hugely beneficial to have the psychologists at the table because they know the social and emotional learning competencies such as self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Also, there's a mandate that we address sexual assault and abuse prevention awareness, and they have the wherewithal to develop lessons on these sensitive subjects, such as safe and unsafe touches, privacy, when to talk to a trusted adult. They could also, because of their knowledge and understanding of childhood development, speak to gaps in our curriculum as well as the best way to deliver lessons. They also are aware of the resources and materials available, and because we want to design curriculum that is meeting the needs of our students, they could pull from the best resources and materials that would be beneficial to us. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Luke Forshaw, principal of Ox Ridge, to talk about supporting families.
First SRBI. So I'm actually going to be speaking a little bit about SRBI, which I know the board is quite familiar with the model, which is a general education initiative designed to provide tiered intervention for students who need support in accessing the learning that's provided through the curriculum that my colleague Julie just spoke to. A second school psychologist is critical for our thorough, systematic implementation of SRBI for social, emotional, and behavioral needs. Currently, we have school psychologists who, as you've heard from the panel, do an excellent job of doing what they can given their time, resourcing. With the second school psychologist, we can more thoroughly and systematically implement SRBI for behavior, social, emotional needs. SRBI is also a vehicle by which we will ensure that the school psychologist is used to meet the needs of general education students, where you've heard from us that we currently don't have that staffing in play. There's tracking relative to the student goals that would be established with the SRBI process. There's data collection around the meetings that are occurring between the SRBI specialist, in this case the additional school psychologist, and the meeting time with classroom teachers, other support personnel. So there's a good deal of information that we would internally gather and use to analyze and evaluate the effectiveness of those positions and be able to celebrate the success of that work with general education students. Really specifically, the 3 tiers of increasing support that the additional school psychologist would, again, more systematically provide to our classrooms would be in that first tier, which is more universal in nature. And just to reiterate a number of the comments my colleagues have made, that's really around co-teaching, doing whole class lessons with classroom teachers, ensuring that those lessons that are designed through our new social emotional curriculum are implemented with fidelity and with their particular child developmental lens in mind. They would be key in those universal supports in providing another set of eyes in terms of looking at the classroom environment, making sure that students had particular goals in the general education population, had those met through classroom teaching and the environment. And students would also get additional support in the more targeted set of SRBI services, which is Tier 2. In the targeted model, we're looking at small group instruction. Having that second psychologist able to support small group instruction more regularly, more systematically, will be a great boon to our schools. It will ensure that those students who right now are receiving that more incidental or reactive approach have a more thorough and ongoing mechanism by which they can learn the coping strategies, the social emotional skills that we're developing as part of our curriculum. And finally, Tier 3, which is more intensive in nature, would allow for psychologists to, on a regular basis, daily if needed, certainly weekly in some situations with students, have ongoing, consistent touch points with those students and their families around progress, growth, and changes to a program that is dynamic in nature given the concerns that we are working with students. So the last feature of the SRBI program that would be enhanced with the additional school psychologist would be in making sure that that information, that data that's gathered around how students are doing and their growth would be shared with families in an ongoing and responsive manner. And with that in mind, I turn it over to my colleague Dean Ketchum from Royal School, who will speak more specifically about the impact for families.
Thank you very much. Certainly the need for an additional psychologist seems paramount, and although our current psychologists exceptionally meet the needs of mandated students requiring mandated services, I hope the following helps illustrate how we can connect and assist families in a better capacity. The following are some categories and bullets that I hope point out some relevant stories and examples. Consultation, communicating effectively and helping parents and families understand what's going on in the school and how they can be helpful at home. With social emotional development, being positive with pro-social skills. Conflict management, which not only occurs at school but oftentimes at home as well. A psychologist is able to provide language, training, and a plan for both home and school. Utilizing the same techniques and language most often results in higher levels of success in home and at school for these students. Crisis recovery, some of these items you've heard before in other presentations, for individuals, families, and communities, helping individuals and families recover from crisis, including changing families, divorce, job loss, existing or witnessing domestic violence, temporary housing, alternate supervised living arrangements, both short and long-term, various and complex reasons for adults in these children's lives, death in the family, including extended family, friends, people in the community that affects children, their classroom, and the entire school community. These events affect not only the students in our school, but the immediate family, their extended family, and the community beyond. They also help in consultation with assessments, test anxiety, explanations and relevance of assessments, reduction of anxiety and relevant outcomes for students. They explain the learning process and student development for parents and agencies regarding child and family welfare. They interface with community agencies for home climate, health, and social emotional stressors, students with severe medical complications, navigating hospitals and agency interactions when intervening with these needs, helping families deal with holidays, traditions, birthdays, etc., when a family member is affected by illness, other siblings and how they're affected in coping, home tutoring services provided by school or outside agencies and the need for planning, coordinating, and communicating with the family, community agencies and resources beyond the school capacity, helping to coordinate these efforts and explain to parents what's going on and what the resources are that are available, facilitating communication and services when multiple agencies are involved, and coordinating an academic plan for students receiving health and mental health services. Parent education, ongoing workshops and planning for families over behavioral interventions for preschool and school-aged children, learning strategies for parents and home connections, referrals to community resources, home interventions and visitations, as well as book references and academic resources, workshops on but not limited to ADHD, learning and motivation, homework help, extensions, and parenting roles, parenting one-on-one, outings to grocery stores, shopping, behaviors that look more like school behaviors and home behaviors, solving behavioral problems, transitions, separation anxiety, assessments, understanding what they are and what they mean, and executive function, both home and school practices, many times requiring home visits to evaluate and assist in the home environment. The stronger the home connection, the more positive the student's school experience and their general well-being into adulthood. And back to Julie. Sorry.
Okay. So now that you've heard how we, psychologists, could and should be of service to our children, their families, and our colleagues, I'd like to briefly illustrate a current day in the life of a school psychologist. We previously shared that the elementary school psychologist's current caseload is comprised of approximately 450 students. We are responsible for all of the children in our building. They are also responsible for supporting our families, and in each building, approximately 90 colleagues, including teachers, other related service providers, and paraprofessionals. Our elementary school psychologists provide direct, mandated counseling services to approximately 40 children with IEPs or 504 plans. So this sample schedule that's projected up on the screen represents a typical best laid planned schedule based on the elementary school 6-day cycle. So this is what the current psychologist has planned to do with his or her week. Our staff, our psychologists, update their schedules as needed, and this schedule that you see before you actually just happens to be the 9th iteration of this particular psychologist's schedule since the start of the school year. Others have more, others have less. And adjustments are made due to presenting student needs and trends in how the psychologist's time is actually being allocated throughout the day. So he or she is constantly going back to that schedule and revising it so that building administration and colleagues know where he or she is supposed to be at any given time. As you can see, and most recently, this psychologist has been holding time in the first 15 to 30 minutes of the school day, so starting right at that 8:30 block, in order to support children who have been demonstrating school avoidance or other dysregulated behaviors. So this is actually fairly new. When children arrive to school in an already dysregulated state, it's critical to ensure that they have access to a school psychologist to help them feel safe at school. Physically and emotionally, and that they're set up for a positive and productive rest of the day. In that morning session, the psychologist might work on calming strategies, problem solving, and once that child is calm, ultimately developing a plan with that child to enter the classroom in a positive way. Once the student is able to enter the classroom and begin the day calmly and productively, there's timely and immediate follow-up with parents and the child's team. It's really important for everybody who's involved with that particular child to know that there was a situation in the morning, that situation is resolved, but that there are recommendations for the remainder of the school day or particular school activities to help the day keep moving smoothly. Likewise, you can see at the end of the day, there's been a need for support in recent weeks for children who might be feeling or might be experiencing dysregulation more towards the end of the day. They sort of held it together for the morning and for those activities going on during the morning, but at the end of the day, their little bodies and their little minds just kind of had enough, and we never want to send a child home to their parents in a dysregulated state either. That's not fun for anyone. Some mornings do begin with PPTs, planning and placement team meetings, or other internal meetings, and these on average can take about an hour or more. And the remainder of the scheduled time is divided between mandated counseling services for children with IEPs or 504 plans and psychoeducational testing. As you know, and as we've previously shared with you, there are sometimes urgent situations that require the psychologist's immediate attention, and in those cases, the schedule you see is put on hold, and that urgent need is addressed. Now, just because the schedule is put on hold doesn't mean that there isn't a need later on to revisit what was supposed to take place during the time when the psychologist was called away. And our psychologists do their utmost to make sure that, you know, anytime they're not able to be where they're scheduled to be, that they ultimately circle back around and make sure that those activities do take place. So you have this here. And Julie Droller, principal of Hinley Elementary School, will speak to how an additional psychologist supports the implementation of a best practice model.
So we don't have an actual schedule, but our vision for what a typical day could look like. The psychologist would start their day in the same way, working with a student who is dysregulated, helping them transition into school. After that, they might co-facilitate a morning meeting lesson in a classroom. Then they might have a PPT or an SRBI meeting where they'd be meeting with a team. Afterwards, they might co-teach a social skills lesson in a classroom. And then after that, they might go out to recess to observe students or support students in social skills. In the afternoon, they might be pulling a variety of small groups. Some of them could be mandated counseling, but they could also pull groups for students who need specific social skills, or a divorce group, or students who are experiencing a loss. After that, at the end of the day, they might be checking in with students or meeting with teachers and teams to provide additional support or do some training. So that's what we envision a typical day looking like. It would expand our mental health services and allow us to provide a more comprehensive school-wide approach. And with that, we welcome any questions that you have.
So, if I may, in sum, this is not about special education. It's about education for all kids, freeing up the psychologist's time to work not only with special ed kids, but with all other kids as well, and to provide services that we currently can't provide. So with that, any questions?
Thank you all for your presentation. It's probably the most thorough presentation we've seen so far, so we appreciate all the time and effort that went into it. With that, I'll open it up to board comments and questions. Mr. Burke.
A couple of questions, because I'm really just trying to understand the numbers. So when you said a few moments ago that it's 450 cases in a building, you're saying whatever the total population is of the building. So actually, this year for 2,111 students, it's an average of 422 a building, not 450, but more importantly, I understand what you're talking about in terms of being proactive and helping the teachers and professional development, and that aspect that a second psychologist would address. But what I'd like to understand is what the actual current caseload is for each psychologist in each building. I don't need that answer right now. It's a number I've been looking for a period of time. So I understand the proactive part, but I'm trying to understand the caseload part combined with the kids that are mandated or your PPTs and all of that. But then the other kids, let's just call them walk-ins because they had trouble getting out of the car or trouble before they go home or their parents are getting divorced. I really just need to understand what those numbers are. And I'm not putting you on the spot now. I don't need to see them right now, but at some point I would like to see that so I can make an evaluation as to an addition of 4 as opposed to another number.
Mrs. Stein.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really helpful, particularly the schedule of a day in the life. I want to clarify something. So the current psychologists are meeting our IEP goals. We're servicing the mandated students. Will the new psychologists be supporting that at all, or do you really see them as, are they fluid? I just want to get an understanding of, are we providing the services we need? The job description you all have provided is huge. And I sit here, and this is not going to be politically correct, but I think are 2 enough in a building when you describe a day in the life? Really. It sounds overwhelming. So I just want to get an accurate sense of, realistically, what the second psychologist will be doing. Will they be really separate from what's going on with the children in special ed, with PPTs, with mandated counseling? How do you really see these 2 psychologists interacting?
So the short answer is to the question about would that second psychologist only be working with a certain population of the school or not, the answer is no. Our philosophy is that we're here for all children, and that the school psychologist would also serve in that fashion. Culturally, all the staff is available for all students in our care, and so the psychologist would follow suit in that way. We would be looking at, and I heard the estimate before, and my math is going to be equally as bad as Christine, I believe, is about, she said 80-20% for the breakdown of current allocation of support for students with IEPs and students in the general education. It's not a bad estimate, 80-20. So imagine if you have another school psychologist. Our vision would be that we would decrease that number from the 80 to, let's say, it's 50-50. We'll be moving the bar for both psychologists to be able to more effectively meet the needs of children who have IEP services and their teams, and for students who are part of the general education experience, who do not have an IEP. So to be looking at a way to increase their access to all students through offloading some of the current IEP hours just from one by distributing across the 2.
Thank you.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So just expanding on that a little bit. So it sounds to me like the psychologists will be splitting the duties in half. So they're both going to do everything. Is that correct?
Correct.
So my concern is there someone on call? In other words, when there's an emergency, how do you know who's going to step in that case? And my follow-up to that is who assigns their tasks? Who builds their schedules?
Great. I think we're playing with different models right now, but one model that could help you make sense of all of that is if, as principals, we were to assign specific grade levels to each psychologist. So, for example, I would say to psychologist number 1, you're responsible for all of the needs of kids in kindergarten, 2nd, and 4th grade, and the other psychologist would be 1st grade, 3rd grade, and 5th grade. And that way, those psychologists could follow those kids up from each grade. So if I start in kindergarten, the following year I would have 1st grade, 3rd grade, and 5th grade. So I'd have my kindergartners from the year before. The following year I'd take 2nd grade. So I'm following the kids. So I'd have a 6-year relationship with the same kids. And that way, if a child's in crisis, we know who's going. It's the psychologist who's assigned to that child. Obviously, there will be little situations, or maybe not little situations, but situations that will come up where there may be a family who is experiencing a crisis and they have 3 children, a death in the family maybe, and we need one psychologist to handle that situation until it's resolved. We may need to make those minor adjustments, but in general, I hope that makes sense to you and how they would divide up the tests equally.
In that type of model, we will not be thinning out each psychologist across all the grade levels, which means they can focus on a finite number of kids and provide real services to half the kids in that school and their families, which they couldn't do if they were spread out K through 5. So
in addition to that, actually, that reminds me that they would also have half of the meetings to go to. So right now, if they're going to be supporting teachers by going to SRBI meetings, they would only have 3 grade levels they'd have to go to, instead of currently they have to go to all 6 of those grade levels.
Mrs. McNamara.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really has fleshed it out quite a bit. I have a couple of questions, but one I wanted to, whether it's for Shirley and for you, I'm looking at the information that was provided to us last week regarding out-of-district placement. So my question is, and that is an issue we've discussed, the community and the board. Right now, for out-of-district placement IEP, there are 3 children with ADD, ADHD. There are 4 out-of-district from a unilateral placement in the elementary schools. In the upper grades, we have students with emotional disturbance. Can you comment, is there any correlation between adding a psychologist in the elementary school and those numbers we're seeing?
I can't imagine a correlation without looking at the data, but I don't know that there's a correlation between the out-of-district placement and school psychologist. I can say, based on our presentation and the number of hours our psychologists spend, that for all students, having a second psychologist will give them a higher level of support. I can't say there's a correlation between placements out and the current level of service.
So, I'm sorry, to clarify then, adding this staff and these resources, you do not see a correlation between those students then being placed out of district?
No.
Mr. Maroney.
I think Mrs. Stein touched on something which well, first off, thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful, and I must say, I'm on.
You need to be closer.
Sorry.
Or louder.
It was a great presentation. Thank you very much. I must say, I'm traumatized myself to hear that elementary school children have suicidal thoughts. I mean, it's something my mind just can't comprehend, and for me, that's enough to bring in psychologists. But I have a question based on what Mrs. Stein said, because I have the same thing of why only one psychologist? With the job description you came across, it sounds like we should have 4 at every school, but why is it only 1?
So can I ask a piggyback question so that you can answer this question fully? There was a comment made that there has been a request for this for the last 3 years. The board has never seen this request. Somebody explain to me either why or how many, but when comments are made like we've been requesting this for 3 years and the board hasn't seen it, that went through a budgeting process of your own.
Well, I don't think
Wasn't here.
I can only surmise that there were issues that came before the board of a budgetary nature that might have had a higher priority. I'm not sure what they might have been. So if it was 2 years, actually, as far as I can tell. And last year, I'm not sure what the reason was, but in an effort to address that need, one of the psychologists who had central office responsibilities was distributed 1 day a week throughout the schools. As to the question of why we don't have 4, well, let me put it to you this way. If I had unlimited funds, it wouldn't just be on psychologists. It would be with so many support services that it would boost our budget by multiple percentages. And we're not going to do that. We're trying to be responsible and address all the needs of all the kids. I personally believe that with 2, based on the numbers of kids we have in every school, this should be sufficient to address those needs. You know, we also have other people in that building who can work with kids and who help kids, just like SCSS, sociologist, a social worker, and the like. But this is a real need. It has been a real need. I have no idea what motivated some budget items to have a higher priority over others in the past. But this year we've made this our highest priority.
So to be clear, though, it's never come before the board.
Correct.
I don't want
That
any
is correct.
misunderstanding that this has come
Oh,
before
no.
the board for 2 years and we haven't addressed
you
it.
are absolutely correct. This has never come before the board before. It was an internal discussion, internal debate, never brought before the board.
Dr. De Silva.
The other piece to, usually I remember that button. The other piece to remember is that we're at a different time. We did not have a structure for SRBI behavior 2 years ago. So in some ways, we were putting the cart before the horse. In addition to that, as you all know, we worked on our health and wellness scope and sequence for the past 2 years, pre-K to 12, which we now have that scope and sequence, which includes both the Connecticut requirements, those that we have to put in by law, as well as social emotional learning standards. With those 2 pieces, that foundation in place, the timing of this, I think, is well warranted. And you remember last year when we had one of the consultants here that was supporting us with our health and wellness curriculum, it was clear then that we needed additional support to implement the curriculum that we expected to be coming in the next year or so.
Thank you. Mrs. Stein.
Dr. Landon touched on other support services. Could you just briefly explain, because we had a conversation here about why not social worker versus psychologist, the role a social worker has in the elementary schools now, how you use the district social workers in your schools, if at all?
We currently do not have access to a social worker. That's not something that we have access to at the elementary. In very unique circumstances, we'll partner with our colleagues in the secondary level to partner with the social worker, particularly for resource knowledge, really to understand what's in the community. But we don't currently have that. The second part of your question, we're hoping to be as agile with the deployment of these mental health professionals as possible, and the school psychologist has the key role of being able to perform evaluations. As we mentioned, we're looking to make sure that we have lots of support for all of our students, and evaluations are a large part of the role. So having the psychologist on site would allow us to be flexible in terms of the responsibilities we provide.
Mrs. McCammon. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I think, Shira, you might be able to distinguish between the role of a psychologist and the role of a social worker.
And certainly not to toot our own horns, but I think Dr. Landon said it best actually in a previous meeting. It doesn't get much better than a school psychologist. We are the Jackson Jills of all trades, as I like to think of us, because quite frankly, you heard the job description and it sounds like a big job, but school psychologists truly are trained to do it all, as it were. It's not just the testing, it's also therapeutic intervention. It's also a very deep understanding of how children learn. So, when a child might be struggling to learn how to read or do math or engage in some of those higher level thinking skills needed to, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a math exemplar before, but you really need to know what you're doing and how to think through those processes. That's what a psychologist is really trained to do, and it's really to support all areas of that child's experience in the school, whether it's academic, social, behavioral. It's really all of it. So,
Mrs. McCammon. So you have very compellingly laid out that the day of the school psychologist is extremely crowded. If I could be a little bit of a nudge and say, we just added in some facilitators a few years ago. So can you please speak to, kind of the idea was to lessen some of the burdens of some of the other support staff so that we would make sure that we were compliant. Can you please speak to the role of the facilitators and that we are fully confident that there is not a way to use that role to alleviate some of the burden of the psychologists? Nobody wants it. I got the same question written down.
I think everyone could speak to that, but if I may just respond to Jill's question, I think the role of the SES facilitator was really to help facilitate the PPT process. They're involved in the coordination of efforts for invitations, for meeting attendance, for processing IEPs, for making sure we're compliant with state timelines and regulations. They're not clinicians. Well, they can be. Actually, one's a speech and language pathologist. We used to have one that was a psychologist. But they're really not responsible for direct intervention with students. They do work and support staff in many ways for compliance with IEPs, but their role is limited to the PPT process and, of course, supporting families and working with families and coordinating all of the aspects of that process.
Mr. Brown.
Just briefly responding to some of the comments, and thank you again for the presentation, a lot of detail there. We've talked about social workers, psychologists. What about psychiatrists, actually? Is that something where that would fit in sort of within schools?
So may I answer that one? Everyone can answer that one as well. For psychiatrists who are medical doctors, we really just have them on a contracted basis. We were actually working with one associated with Yale this year. We really reach out to them when we need that level of evaluation, not from day-to-day support for students.
Could I ask a question about how do we identify, in some of the descriptions you gave, it's a very new way of thinking about a school's role and what a school's role is versus a parent's role. And so how do we identify where those lines are? I can hear the questions. That's really why I'm asking that, like, well, why is that the school's job? And can you speak a little bit to some of the things you've described, why that has become the school's job?
Because of the impact on learning, because the students are not available for learning when they come to school in distress or in crisis, or when they are emotionally fragile because of something that happened outside with their family or with their friend. And that's what's on their mind. So it's just, or there's pervasive behaviors. So they're just not available for learning.
So it would be fair to say that this is, new is not the right term, but let's say if someone went to school when we all were in elementary school, this is a new way of thinking about really how to educate a whole child. I mean, those structures, as I remember, were not in place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of research available that about educating the whole child, and that the social emotional curriculum is equally as important as the academic curriculum, particularly for the 21st century skills that we know students need for global citizenship.
I saw other hands. I'm sorry. Mrs. McNamara.
Two questions. From a structural standpoint, to whom will this individual report? Is the building to the principals? Okay. And then could you talk a little bit more, say that now 50%, or now it's 20%, hopefully going to 50%, where that individual will be more proactive in facilitating curriculum. Is that just going to be drawing upon, Susie, what you've done with SEL, or where is that curriculum going to come from? How do we know it's unified if we've got now 5 different buildings? Is it going to be different? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I'll start, and then I'm sure the principals will add on. With respect to the consistency among schools, we thrive on that. We thrive on structure and consistency. So we have a curriculum of which we'll be working under. Our school psychologist will co-teach when it's appropriate to co-teach, or provide individual lessons. In particular, with some of those lessons where the topics may be more sensitive, and so they may be the direct facilitator of those lessons, and the classroom teacher may be more of a secondary role, where in other cases they may be co-teaching, or there may be a particular teacher who's new to a grade level or new to teaching, and therefore needs additional support that a more seasoned teacher might not need. So that structure is in place with the scope and sequence that we have. As Julie described, curriculum's dynamic, it's responsive, it's ever changing. We developed a skills-based health curriculum that allows for different topics to come in as they come up. As we know right now, for example, vaping is more relevant now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. Delete vaping, insert the next thing that we need to support our children with. When you develop a skills-based health curriculum, our school psychologists, they're doing that research. They're seeing what's happening out in the world. They're inserting those topics and supporting our teachers with it in a very structured and systematic way that we did not have 2 or 3 years ago.
So will these 5 individuals have the opportunity to work together in their own PLC time to?
I believe that all of our administrators would say that that's essential as part of the role.
Thank you.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So just to expand on what Krista said, what I wanted to ask Susie was, are these psychologists being added essential to adding your curriculum and completely rolling out the social and emotional learning? Are they essential? And it sounds like they are an essential part of that.
I would say they're critical for 2 pieces. Certainly the curriculum, but the piece around SRBI and supporting our teachers and our students at that Tier 2, more specifically the Tier 3 level, I would say that they bear a great level of responsibility in supporting individual children in a proactive way, pre-referral way, as well as our teachers in expanding their toolkit. So when they see a student who has a particular behavior that was similar to the teacher next door's behavior, they can now expand what they know and are able to do with that particular student.
Mr. Burke.
Usually this is Denny's type of question, but how will you measure the success of this increase? The picture now as to what the picture would look like with this additional staffing, or how much worse it might be without it. And again, this isn't necessarily a question that needs to be answered now, but I think anything that's new, I mean, there has to be a way to kind of evaluate how well it's going. To Mrs. Stein's point, like, you know, maybe ultimately more would be needed, but I think if we're at this, first step, we ought to have a good idea of how you're going to evaluate this success or the failure of this endeavor.
I think we can think more about that, but I can start off by saying we can take some proactive steps to address the needs of all of our kids, as opposed to just being able to address the mandated expectations. So that can be measured very easily because it's not happening except incidentally right now.
Did I see another hand?
Sorry, and I'd also say likewise, the schedule was put up previously just to show you how the time is being spent. So, empirically, we want to see an increase in time, as Paula mentioned earlier. We want to see time on that psychologist schedule for dedicated to coaching and dedicated to being inside of the classroom. That's something that we can measure. We can take a look at the schedule and see how much time is being dedicated to that.
If I can just piggyback on that, I think because that was my next question. But I think it's of utmost importance for us as the board to understand how you're going to metric it, so we can help measure with you, and then and offer up more assistance if it's needed quickly.
Additionally, people are looking for analytics. If we did,
but this should have analytics to it. It shouldn't just be I mentioned last week, I think at some point you have to take a leap of faith to do this. So maybe because it seems like we're already behind, honestly, if elementary kids have suicidal thoughts. But, I don't want to wait too long until we have something more catastrophic go through. But I think we have to really be honest with ourselves and say we need a way to measure this so we can prove the success of it, and therefore, can we even beef it up more in 2, 3, well, I don't know what number of years, but and build a gold class standard of social and emotional learning, and not just do the minimum we need to do. I just want to touch on one thing Susie said as well. I think it's very important, and it wasn't really touched on. I think some of the curriculum that we roll out can be difficult for the students to manage. I don't remember elementary school. My kids are much older, but I remember when my middle school kids went through the Holocaust, and we had to have long discussions at home to discuss that. And one of the other ones I remember in middle school was Joseph Kony, the Ugandan leader. My little one still has a Kony sticker on her door with a slash through it. But that was another long, difficult discussion that is driven by the school's curriculum that I think can really affect children. And as well, I think one of the things you mentioned, Mary, as well, was students having meltdowns on the bus or in classrooms. I think what we also have to think about with that as well is, for lack of a word, the collateral damage that meltdown has on the other students that aren't having the meltdown, and what effect it's having on them and their desire to go to school, or their desire, when they come home and their mom's like, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," but something's really bothering me. They don't understand how to verbalize it, and I think this is where you need to have this extra psychologist, or plural, to go and deal with these problems that we don't even see festering, that are probably festering under the surface.
I was going to say that a long-term metric would be measuring the kinds of behaviors that we see evidencing themselves at the high school level currently, and long-term, taking a look to see, once this is implemented, what is the long-term impact of engaging kids early on with these kinds of support services, to see if it doesn't reduce that. And the other area I think we should take a hard look at, put more in the short term, is the impact on SRBI. Because I really believe that with this extra support, we can do more at level 1, we can do more at level 2, and we can do more at level 3, so that we are able to address all of the needs of these students in-house, rather than having to deal with issues either outside of the district or in the district, that some of our kids have problems some of our kids are facing right now.
Can I just follow up then? As I understood your comment then, that perhaps, does this still not go into our outplacement numbers, or might it go into our outplacement numbers for the high schoolers or the middle schoolers? Correct.
So, Dr. Lane, if I may respond.
Because I think, Shirley, you said no, that you do
there's
not
no
see a
way
correlation between this.
So maybe I can clarify. There's no way to really correlate that question as to students who are outplaced and the impact a second psychologist would have had if they were present at the time prior to outplacement. So you can't have a correlation to that. There's no way to correlate that information. I think what you can correlate is, and what the presentation speaks to is, the more early intervention we do, the more pre-referral we do, the more opportunity we have, and this answers the second question, I think, of how do you measure the success? By student performance and success. By looking at a decrease in behaviors, which, as Dr. Lennon was saying, you look at it over periods of time going all the way through middle school and high school. But you'll see on an annual basis, on a monthly basis, on a short-term basis, a decrease in interfering behaviors that allow children to learn, an increase in social skills that allow children to engage in positive relationships with each other and with family and peers, an increase in positive behaviors not only available for learning, but for really being and teaching the high level of social emotional learning, of compassion, of exchange of ideas and respecting, of tolerance, of all the attributes we want to instill in our children. Those are correlations I think we can make and look at a yearly basis, and that might go to answer Mr. Burke's question as well as Mr. Maroney's questions. We'll measure it by student performance and student success. There's no way, honestly, that I can answer you and go back and look at data. Could there have been hypothetically a correlation between additional staff and outplacements?
Mrs. McCammon.
Piggybacking a little bit on what Shirley's saying, is there any really good research-based information? I mean, your story is very compelling, and I appreciate it. But I'd love to know if there's anyone out there writing on this topic that could talk to us in a what feels like a more objective way. That's probably not the right word, but what's out there?
So certainly the National Association on School Psychologists publishes ongoing research that's being done. And I think earlier, Dr. McCarthy or Shirley may have spoken to the Child Mind Institute's Children's Mental Health Report. There are two different reports that came out that really speak to a growing incidence of mental health issues in young children, and consistently that research is coming back talking about a prevention-oriented approach, particularly for children age 3 to 6 years old. That was the most recent, the 2018 Children's Mental Health Report. I'm actually glad that I have it here. And likewise, that research is also showing that the provision of early therapeutic intervention is showing sustained benefits for about 8 to 13 years following that support that's being provided. I think most recently, in 2018, Teachers College at Columbia University also put out a survey in the immediate area that showed that, most adults do understand that children who aren't emotionally and socially and behaviorally supported just aren't available for learning, and that they need those supports in order to succeed. So the research really does support that there is a growing incidence of mental health concerns among young children, and that early intervention and prevention-based programs are showing promising outcomes later down the line. Thank you.
Mr. Deneen.
I guess just to follow up on a couple of comments, but I guess thank you, great presentation, great dialogue and discussion, but you could say from your professional opinion that this is becoming the new norm in the evolution of education. And I think we have to look at it a little broadly like that. It's beyond reading, writing, science, and math. It is now the social well-being and emotional well-being of a student, and that has become part of what we do in terms of educating and taking care of our students. So with that said, if you've heard the conversation from our colleagues at the RTM, from our colleagues in the Board of Finance and stuff like that, is, thinking more strategically down the line. And so I think part of the questions from Mr. Burke, is two enough? I would ask that you keep us informed, and it's important via the metrics, that this sounds like something that could continue to evolve based on what we see our students need, and as more students become identified. So, I always feel like we're good for 2, and then next year we're having the same conversation, and people are like, you kind of said we were good last year with 2. So that's where I think a few more statistics around caseload and stuff like that helps inform us that as you continue to do this good work, this will be an ongoing dialogue, and I think it should be.
While we are appreciative of the thoughts around increased staffing, I think there's 2 thoughts I echo with Dr. Landon. One is that we also share your responsibility in being good financial stewards. And additionally, we are, and the research supports collaboration as a key driver of success for students. So an analogy would be, we have children who have reading needs, and so we have a reading specialist, 1.5 reading specialists to support those reading needs. But what's most critical is that you have good classroom teachers who can help those students transfer those skills back to the more generalized setting. You need a consistent platform for students to practice and get really comfortable with the utilization of those skills taught in those more intensive settings. And so while we're making the request for the additional school psychologists to help with that more intervention and intensive teaching, it's going to be really critical that they have very clear methods for the students to transfer those skills back to the general education classroom, and that parents are really, really clear about what those strategies are, what those structures are that help students, so that they have lots of time to generalize and practice, as Dean talked about, in the community, in family gatherings, and so on. So that will be part of the approach in using these psychologists to make sure that their services are effective, that they have legs. And just one last thought about the data collection piece, because I can't help myself, I'm sorry. We have kind of macro and micro metrics that we already collect on students. We do need to do really good thinking around what those would be specifically to come back and share out here in this context, share internally, so that we are really clear about what's working and where we need to adjust. Some of those that just pop to mind currently are at a micro level for SRBI. These are general education students. there are goals that are written, that are quantified. They're metric-driven goals for students. The student will be able to X, Y, and Z as measured by a decrease, and so on. That's easy to review, aggregate, look at across the system. Are we making those student learning progress markers that we set out? We have teacher evaluation structures in place, all of which have a quantifiable goal that's associated with them. Every certified staff member, ourselves included, are beholden to the teacher evaluation plan, and there are goals inside of those that are quantitatively driven. So we'd be looking at the psychologist's goals. Are we writing goals that are really mindful of the current needs of students and tracking them on that kind of teacher performance over the year, if that makes sense? And then those more macro level data points, which we've talked about before, which are contact points between teachers, contact points between families and schools, and so on. Those sort of like, is the schedule reflecting what we hope it should reflect? And so some composite of those macro and micro, I think, will give us a really nice view of the success.
So I want to jump in just because I have two questions, both on the points you made. First, I want to be clear. If for some reason we didn't put these psychologists into the budget, what I'm hearing is the problems don't go away. The psychologist schedule doesn't change. So what we're saying is we're adding to the duties of the classroom teacher, because the classroom teacher has to deal with what's going on.
The entire school community.
So the entire school community is carrying this load, and the question is whether we decide as a board that we are putting in additional staff, or this is something we are requiring of, as one example, a general education classroom teacher who is not a trained psychologist, but is now dealing with problems that are best served by a trained psychologist.
Yes, because Ms. Ackman, that's what happens now. It's not that we avoid supporting a child that's in need, whether that's through SRBI, whether we had a structure or we didn't. But the reality is, just like on the academic side, you want the most specialized folks working with children that require that specialized or have a specialized need, whether that's acute or long-term. So the psychologists support us doing that, building the capacity of our teachers. Currently, we have one psychologist that's doing everything that they're doing. How do we grow the capacity of our teachers so when that student comes in the room, they know how to navigate that child best? That's through the support of the school psychologist who is specialized in that area.
Okay, thank you. And then the other point on data collection, should the board require some sort of data collection? And we have not had that conversation, but, and this is just an example, if we were to require a psychologist track the amount of time they are spending with any one population of students, special education, SRBI, or a child who is just, it sounds like a prison general population, but you know what I mean? A student who has no identified services, but for whatever reason is in a crisis and is accessing it, that would be possible to track.
Sure, I think they do that now.
That's what,
Well, okay, well, this is what I'm getting at,
be-
because we're being asked for analytics,
Yeah.
and people have said, I was asking it so you could say it, but
Yes.
go ahead.
That would actually be fairly easy because, as you saw that school psychologist schedule, then that's what the schedule is, and they turn that in, or we get reports from, like, okay, this one they came into it, they crossed it off, they couldn't do it, they had to do a crisis. So we have those schedules on a week-to-week basis, so we can tell you, who's doing it. It really is, it's going back to your first question, to who's going to take care of all of this. It's right now, it's on the school psychologist is really trained in that area. And what we're finding now is that the teachers are being pulled in so many different ways, and they're not trained to work on those behaviors, and the behaviors are not going away. They're just getting more and more. And so if we had somebody that was focused on just working on social emotional or helping us with all those issues, it would really, I think there'd be a huge difference between a year from now. And it would be, we could find the data on it. Just from the support from the teachers would, have such positive reports.
Mr. Brown, I see your hand. Thank
You did, thank you. I guess just following up, there was a point made that it wouldn't be fair to do a look back hypothetically, what could have happened. I guess the question would be in terms of analytics and metrics and goals. Wouldn't really be fair to say because we have psychologists that they were 100% the result of any progress that occurs. So I guess the question would be, I've heard of scheduling, I've heard there's some objective analytics that can be tracked. Would love to see how that would play out so we could have something to look in a year, 2 years, 5 years, what those criteria are and measure, as opposed to saying, well, we can't we're just going to bring them in and see how it goes. I think we'd like to know what that framework looks like in some detail, so we can measure and have accountability going forward.
Mrs. McNamara.
This is a question more for the administration. Isn't there some movement in Hartford requiring administrations to report to boards of student behavior issues I've heard of? And wouldn't that fall into these metrics and measurements that we're talking about?
Are you referring to bullying?
I think for years,
It's bullying or injurious
There was-
behavior, disruptive behavior.
There was the legislation that I
Right.
believe was, and I don't think it got passed, around teachers being able to excuse students from their classrooms and choose to no longer teach them if there was disruptive behavior. But I don't.
Right,
think it
there was, no, but there was talk again that it might be coming back. So perhaps this data of children who are, self-injurious or disruptive, which was one of the categories that you've mentioned, perhaps you were already looking at that data anyway.
I believe the legislation required violent behavior in the classroom.
we're required to report on expulsions and suspensions, and give that to the state.
This was to the board. This legislation was right to the board, but, okay, well, I can find out where that stands and if it might be coming up again. But it might fall into your data collection anyway and be part of something
Yeah,
you'd be
because I
presenting.
believe, if we're talking about the same thing, from my knowledge, is that it required violent behavior within the classroom and the teacher's ability to take action. That doesn't mean that there's not a new iteration of it coming up, which is
Right.
what you may have heard recently.
It's just that examples
And it
of
required
recording and then reporting back to board. So just that, back to the data that we could be looking for.
Mr. Marone.
Yeah, one of the metrics that I think about, and maybe this is just the way my mind works, is that one of the things this board has always been frustrated with, especially my colleague to the left, is substitutes. And I would think that if you have more support and help, that you have happier teachers, you have less teachers taking mental health days because you have difficulty in the classroom, and I would think that would be a metric that we could really see a financial gain on, of that we'd have less sick days. And then, and then as well as you have better coherence in teaching because you have the teacher there full time as opposed to having a substitute. But that's just the way I think, so.
Further board questions and comments? Mr. Barker.
I neglected to say thank you for the fine presentation. I asked some questions. I neglected to say thank you.
All right, we thank you very much. As you know, this is a hot topic and will continue to be discussed, so we appreciate your thoughts and expertise on it. I'm sure questions will still continue to rise as we move through this entire budget process. So we thank you, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from you again. Thank you. Dr. Landon, we'll move on with updates on board questions on the budget. Packet.
In your package, you received some follow-up questions that you had pending from the January 5th and the January 8th meetings. We can go through line by line of some of the responses and answer any questions that you may have. The first one had to do with RC26, the early learning program.
Can I just hold you for one
Sure.
second? We'll go through these. We have an additional meeting on the 22nd, so let's go through some of the answers, but if there's another lengthy discussion, flag it, and we can also make time on the 22nd for it in the interest of time. Mr. Feeney.
So we provided the 5-year history of tuition increases for the early learning program for you. There was also a question regarding the license requirements for ELP and the Oxford specifications and whether or not that it met those requirements. We did go back. We reviewed the Connecticut School Construction Standards and Guidelines, and Oxford specifications are complying with those guidelines. We also looked at the enrollment, and we believe, based upon the enrollment, that there would be enough rooms. Right now, we're forecasting 10 rooms, anywhere between 10 to 15 students, which would accommodate anywhere from 100 to 150 students per classroom. The state standards do require that you have a minimum of 1,000 square feet for pre-K in a public building, and we've also accommodated the additional bathroom as well. The elementary psychologist, we just discussed that question. I do have a handout, and we can entertain any additional questions. It was updating the spreadsheet to match all of the sports offered by Darien, as well as to account for the number of participants per sport and identified the teams that cut. In addition, the stipend amounts. And the stipend amounts were also attached in Attachment B. I do apologize for the late handout for the response of the updated spreadsheet to match all of the sports, which I'll hand out now. We did have some difficulty tracking down all of the teams. We did have responses from Greenwich, New Canaan, as well as Staples. We're waiting to hear from Ridgefield and Wilton, but it does give you an idea as to where people are. So when you want to compare the number of coaches versus the number of participants, you'll be able to at least see the comparison with 3 other communities in addition to Darien. And we're still working on a couple of the communities of getting responses as well, but it has been short notice, and for some of the ADs to participate in a survey like this is a little bit challenging. Another question had to do with the Greenwich Y and the Boys and Girls Club, and whether or not there are any Title IX issues associated with this. There are no Title IX issues associated with this, and we do have the girls' swim team is utilizing the Girls and Boys Club. And we took it out of the budget last year for the boys, and there's an explanation from the athletic director a little bit more in the package. Under RC1 DHS, the revenue for the Turkey Bowl, a question of police and fire coverage and which school who takes in all the revenue. The host of the event does receive all the revenue and pays for all of the expenses associated with the event. The one item that I wanted to highlight was that the district does pay for monitors to attend the event, and that is on our own dime to make sure that student behavior is acceptable. RC Technology, there was a question of the 5-year schedule of a technology capital plan and the continuation of the one-to-one rollout. We do have an adopted 4-year technology plan that goes into 1920. Unfortunately, going out to further years after 1920 has not been adopted as of yet. In talking with the technology director, that's something that would be worked on over the summer months, so we'd have another rollout of the 4-year plan. But a snapshot of where we were for the 4 years is included in your package under Attachment C. An update to the FOIA log is also been included as Attachment D.
Board comments or questions? Could I just ask, this comes up every year as we move forward with the budget. The technology plan, the rollout at this point, my understanding from Jeff's report is at this point that is a predictable number year over year for the incoming grades with both Chromebooks and iPads, and planning for what we've seen as normal wear and tear. But there are no longer years for which we are buying, we need to buy just to roll out. We are now kind of in a predictable pattern of you should be seeing these amounts roughly every year for incoming grades.
Yes.
Am I correct? Thank
That's
you.
what he reported on.
So expanding on that, we will see some sort of report from technology, though, as they come forward with a more comprehensive plan, knowing that that dollar amount probably will be fairly consistent. But are they going to give us a plan, or are we just going to assume that that's the number going forward?
No. So the plan is that the tech committee did put together the 4-year plan. It's the intention of the technology director to basically develop over the summer the outlying years, the 4-year plan that would go before the board. So I would envision over the summer months for him to basically update this and look out to the ensuing 4-year period.
Thank you.
Any other board comments or questions on this? Mrs. McNamara.
Back under RC11, with the comments about the Greenwich Y, what was the fee for the Greenwich Y and the New Canaan Y? That could come back to us.
Okay.
Am I correct? Those are the fees that we currently see in the budget?
Yes.
It can come
wanna
back.
clarify.
Yeah, it can come back to us. My understanding is those are the fees we see in the budget. But Mr. Feeney,
For New Canaan and Greenwich?
No,
The rental fees?
The Greenwich Boys and Girls Club was dropped for the boys last year. So that is the number that could potentially come back. It's right here in what Chris said, so it could potentially come back if there is a new swim coach for the boys. The current swim coach for the boys did not need the Sunday practice, so it was eliminated.
Okay, so that spreadsheet, to clarify, is the fee for the New Canaan and the Greenwich, New Canaan, and then the Greenwich Y for the girls.
We'll let Mr. Feeney come back to us with it. Any other questions? Mrs. McCammon?
I just have a comment for going forward. We talked a lot about the budget control report. I'm grateful to have it. Thank you. My comment is for going forward, I think it would be helpful for us to understand how it was used. So if we could begin tracking how it was used so that in future years, as we look at it, we understand what the components of the decision are.
Absolutely.
And just
Mrs. Ritchie?
we do that in our budget meetings, and then we come to the board and we approve those transfers. So I think we're asking Mike, we already do the work, but maybe if you could provide it to us in a more succinct format, and so that we can look at it and see, oh yeah, remember, this is what we already did. So
Yes.
we do see that information, we approve that information, but it would be good for our analytical purposes to see that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the board votes on all releases of budget control, but if it's helpful to have a snapshot of it, I think, in future budgets. Mr. Maroney?
Appendix B1, and I don't know if anyone has this answer. Do we need Chris? What are the differences of categories, and why is football category 1? I never saw the answer of why.
So that's within the teaching budget?
That's the salary, but it doesn't tell me why. You know, my question is, why is girls soccer, boys soccer category 3 when you're coaching at least 11 kids on the field, but girls volleyball or boys volleyball has 6 players in a contained court, and basketball has 5, and that's a category 2, which is more money. So I don't quite understand the difference of why one is more and one is less when you're dealing with even less children. So I'd like a little more clarity.
We did spend a lot of time in negotiations redoing the schedule. It still has work. The teachers came with an analysis, a detailed analysis of where they thought different coaches should be. You may have different feelings. You may know better, but we have negotiations coming up in August, and so it'll be time to look at that schedule.
This is
again.
not driven by the CIAC, so this is driven by negotiations from the unions. Okay.
And I will say, I did kind of a thumbnail sketch the first year that I figured out the teacher's contract. And it's pretty in line with every town I could find. These categories seem to be pretty generalized across the state. It is part of negotiations, but for some reason, football coaches are always category 1. Any other board questions on the packet? Okay, seeing none, thank you again for such a quick turnaround on these. I'm sure we'll digest them. I encourage board members, please send questions so we can get them to the administration, because send them to me, I'll forward them on if they pop up in the meantime. We have another meeting on the 22nd. We have our public hearing, I believe, on the 29th. So I'd just like to get the board as much information
Oh, I'm
as
sorry,
possible.
I meant to, were we going to get, now I can't find it in here, but were we going to get more information on the counselors, or was it just on the psychologists?
Nothing more on the
Yeah, we have not asked for more on the counselors, but if there's more, we can, and please send those questions.
Okay.
I think the question was, what distinguishes the role of the psychologist from the role of the counselor? I'm sorry, Shira was here. There is a significant difference on the basis of their training, their skills, and what they're capable of doing. Just as there's a difference between social workers and psychologists, so there is between psychologists and counselors. We'll have that for you at the next meeting.
Okay, because it just did say on that sheet that we got that it was going to be follow-up on counselors just like the psychologists. So
Yeah.
and it said
It
for
got
tonight.
melded into the psychologist. We'll have it for you at the next meeting.
Okay.
Mrs. McCammon?
I think the other question on the counselors was similar to the psychologists. You all gave a tremendous snapshot of what it looks like today, but we'd love to understand what your goal is in terms of what you're looking at in terms of scheduling. What is the capacity you're trying to get to?
So maybe it'd be best at our next meeting to ask Mrs. Summers to come again. So
We shall.
Thank you. Any other board comments or questions? Mrs. McNamara?
I did ask a clarification. With the curriculum supervisors, for the proposed change, just to clarify.
You mean the department chairs?
Department chairs,
Okay.
sorry, thank you. Department chairs, with the proposed change, that the impact on the budget is under Darien Middle School, .2 and .82, correct?
The total, I think
Does
the
that sound
total
right?
was .82, was it not?
Yes, but then there's also an impact on some of the individual lines as well. So if you're moving one of the current, let's just say, an employee from Fitch that is assigned there by .2, moving that over to the middle school by the .2, there'd be someone else that would be coming in to fill that .2 that's at Fitch. So when you move the teaching positions out, you'd be backfilling those teaching positions.
Makes sense.
So it's a one-for-one. With that being said, the dollar value may change.
Do we have that number capsulized somewhere?
We can break that down, yes.
Is that something people would be comfortable with, just to see what is the dollar value of that proposed change? Okay, thank you.
Any other board comments or questions? Okay, seeing none, we will adjourn. May I have a motion to adjourn? Sorry.
Do you need-
Can I have a motion?
To
There's
the
no public comment at the end on this agenda,
Right.
special meeting. May I have a motion to adjourn? Mrs. Ritchie and Mr. Burke, all in favor? That is unanimous. Thank you very much, everybody.
It's 46 minutes.